I'm Hannah. I'm a provisional psychologist here at Graham Psychology, and today we're going to be talking through how anger can present as a secondary emotion. So today I want to walk you through a really important concept when it comes to understanding emotions, and that's the idea of primary and secondary emotions. We can think of emotions as layered. So primary emotions are our immediate, automatic, and authentic responses. These are things like the first feelings that show up in a situation, like fear or sadness or shame, and they're often more vulnerable and a bit harder to sit with. Secondary emotions come after that. They're emotional reactions to the primary feeling, and they're often shaped by our past experiences, what we've learned, and how we cope with discomfort. One of the most common secondary emotions that we see is anger. And importantly, secondary emotions often serve a purpose. They can protect us from feeling vulnerable and help us regain a sense of control and reduce discomfort quickly. Before we go any further, it's important to say clearly that anger is not a bad emotion. In fact, anger is adaptive and it has a function. Anger can signal things like injustice or unfairness, a threat or danger or a boundary being crossed, frustration when something's blocking our goals, or even unmet needs. Physiologically, anger activates the body for action. It increases energy, sharpens our focus, and prepares us for a fight response. So the goal isn't to get rid of anger. The challenge is when anger becomes the only emotional we express, because then that's when we often lose access to the deeper information that it's trying to communicate. Very often, anger sits on top of more vulnerable emotions. Underneath anger, we might find things like hurt, fear, shame, sadness, rejection, or even helplessness. But anger can feel easier to access. It gives us a sense of strength instead of vulnerability, control instead of uncertainty, and distance instead of emotional closeness. Sometimes I describe anger as a type of bodyguard emotion. It steps in to protect us, but if we only respond with anger, we can miss what's actually driving it underneath. So how does this pattern develop? For many people, vulnerability doesn't feel safe, and that often comes from early emotional experiences. We all learn, consciously or unconsciously, which emotions are allowed and which ones aren't. Feelings like sadness, fear, or shame can feel exposing, uncomfortable, or even risky to express. Over time, anger can become a kind of emotional shortcut. Something happens, there's a vulnerable primary emotion that feels uncomfortable or threatening, and anger takes over. Anger is more energizing, more protective, and it creates a sense of control and can push away perceived threats. So the brain learns that works. The issue is, while anger might help us cope in the moment, the underlying emotion often remains unresolved. It's also important to distinguish between primary and secondary anger. Primary anger is a direct response to something like a boundary violation or injustice. It's usually proportionate to the situation. Secondary anger, on the other hand, tends to mask something deeper. It might feel more intense, sudden, or even confusing. Some helpful cues that anger might be secondary include that it escalates quickly, it feels protective, or it's followed by guilt or shame afterwards. These are often signs that there's something more vulnerable sitting underneath. So when we're working with anger, either personally or clinically, it can be really helpful to slow down and get curious. Some useful reflective questions might be, what happened right before the anger showed up? What did that moment mean to me? Was there hurt, fear, or shame underneath? What does the anger feel like it's protecting? And what need is not being met right now? The goal here is to shift from asking, why am I angry, to a more helpful question. What is the anger trying to signal? And finally, from a clinical perspective, working with anger isn't about shutting it down. It's about understanding it. We start by validating its function, acknowledging that anger makes sense and it tells us that something matters. Then we build emotional awareness, so helping identify what's sitting underneath, whether that's hurt, fear, or shame. We explore unmet needs, things like safety, respect, connection, or control. And importantly, we focus on regulation before reflection, so grounding, breathing, and pausing before trying to unpack the emotion. From there, we can support more helpful ways of expressing what's going on through assertiveness, boundaries, and self-compassion. Because when we can access what's underneath anger, we're actually much better equipped to respond in a way that aligns with what we really need.